Welcome to episode 3 of Beyond the Obvious, a podcast series organised by FASTA, the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability, and the European Health Futures Forum. I'm Caroline White.
And I'm Sean O'Cunline. We're very pleased to introduce a new member of our team on this month's podcast.
I'm Claire Houlihan, I'm 16. I'll be joining in on this podcast series to give my impressions and ask a few questions about the topic we're discussing.
In this episode, we'll be questioning some of the standard assumptions that tend to get made about identity and ownership that can have damaging effects on our environment and our communities.
Later on, we'll be hearing from Órla O'Donovan from the School of Applied Social Studies in University College Cork, who's done extensive research into the commons, which provide an alternative relationship to the economy and the biosphere that falls outside the more usual market or state dichotomy.
But first, we're going to hear a manifesto that has been written and recorded by Paddy Bushe.
Paddy Bushe is a poet and a philosopher who lives in the southwest of Ireland on the Iveragh Peninsula. He has a particular liking and fondness for some of the old mythology stories about Ireland and also about ecological impact of the way we live in Ireland and particularly in the southwest of Kerry.
A Migrant Poet's Ecological Manifesto. My house sits on a low cliff overlooking Ballinskellig's Bay in Iveragh in southwest Kerry. The cliff is soft, being composed of clay and small boulders. It is there since the last ice age. Glacial drift carried down from mountains a few kilometres inland and deposited here when the slow-moving ice reached the sea. It is just one aspect of the land shaping by glacial action that you can see all over this area. One of the most beautiful places in Ireland owes a large part of its character to what happened during a very different climate which lasted until about 12 millennia ago. In the millennia and centuries since then, the action of the tides, especially when driven by stormy weather coinciding with the spring tide, has been eroding that glacial moraine of clay and gravel. Even when we bought our house, we were vaguely conscious that at some distant time it would become vulnerable to the encroaching sea. But that was almost half a century ago, and we were young. Now, however, climate change of a man-made sort is accelerating that process, and the last 7 or 8 years has seen more incremental erosion than all our previous time here. All of a sudden, it seems the distant future is the immediate and frightening present. Of course, the house will be there for the remainder of our lifetime. But if sea levels rise, according to even the more moderate predictions of the scientific community, our beloved grandchild may well see the house he visits fall into the sea. Climate change has, for us, become a personal issue. I say all of this by way of an introduction to a poem which has increasingly fascinated me for over 40 years. A poem ascribed to a mythological figure, the leader of a migrant group making an unauthorized landing. Amergin was the poet leader of the Milesian or Gaelic people who, according to Untitled Chapter, written down roughly a millennium ago, made their way from Galicia in northwestern Spain to the very shoreline where my house is perched on this sea-threatened cliff. As they landed, Untitled Chapter tells us, Amergin put his right foot on the shore and recited a poem of identification with the surrounding landscape. This Milesian myth became part of a national and subsequently nationalist narrative of ownership, of possession. what I would like to do is to suggest that the story and the poem can be given another reading, a reading that reflects the reality of a migratory world, largely post-national, threatened with extinction because our overwhelmingly exploitative relationship with the land and the sea. Here is what Amergin recited, first in my translation into modern Irish, and then into English. Me gae muir, me town dílan, me glór mara, me dav shacht górach, me fjallar eil, me dior drochta fuin rain, me áilecht fáis, me tark gail, me bradán sa lin, me loch bhá, me sí agana, me ga fui vua slí sa cha, me dia einen tinne sa cheann. Cé dhéanann réig clochán slé, cé chahan solas chrochanna na gealaí, cé ógrian cá luigh an ghrian, cé hróiríonn na réalta mar bhath na mara, cé a heilsíonn na réalta sin. Cén draum, cén dia chur an féir lana in nún ailse, cuine na ngá, cuine na gaoithe. Am wind on sea, am wave swelling, am ocean's voice, am stag of seven clashes, am falcon on cliff, am sunlit dewdrop, am rarest of herbs, am boar enraged, am salmon in pool, am lake in plain, am learning's essence, am sharpened spear dealing death, am God who kindles fire in the head, who makes smooth the stony mountain, who elucidates the lives of the moon, who proclaims where the sun will rest, who leads the stars like cattle from the ocean, on whom do those stars smile? What troop, what god edges blades in a plague-struck fortress? Keening of weapons, keening of wind. In my English translation, I use the repeated am rather than I am for two reasons. Firstly, I feel that the poem can be read and heard as a communal rather than an individual identification with place, an expression of a universal consciousness. Related to this, the original Middle Irish poem uses the Old Irish synthetic form rather than ismisha or ismay, thus removing the personal pronoun from the statement. Secondly, that reminds me of the sacred word Om of Hindu and Buddhist mysticism. That may or may not be purely coincidence, but if so, it is at least a very serendipitous coincidence which I wanted to foreground. And in this regard, it has been pointed out that Amergin's poem has strong echoes of Krishna's statements of universality in section 10 of the Bhagavad Gita. Wherever it originated from, the poem Amergin recited on the shoreline just below my house long predated the beliefs of the monastic scribes who wrote it down 1,000 years ago. But let me return to the present, or more importantly, the future. Our planet is faced with an imminent existential crisis, socially and environmentally. Our world will survive only if we recognize that the exploitative ownership and possession paradigm we have followed has failed, And on foot of that recognition, we begin to act as if we and other life forms are part of a universal organism in which all the components are interrelated and interdependent. This means that we must identify ourselves with the other life forms of the earth, the sea, and the sky. And this is what Amergin's poem does. The poet, on behalf of his people, proclaims that he is the wind, is the sea, is the falcon, is the flower, is the salmon, is the lake, and so forth. If we can arrive at that level of consciousness, we can begin to stop destroying the basis of our own existence. And let us not forget that Amergin and his people were migrants. As Mary Robinson tirelessly points out, those who are already suffering most from climate change are the poorest, usually those whose territories have been for centuries exploited by richer countries which, even in post-colonial times, continue to fatten themselves at the expense of the weak. The primary purpose of the Leabhar Gabhála myth was to validate and elevate the Gaelic settlement of Ireland. Even so, there is an awareness throughout the narrative, particularly on the part of Amergin, of other races, languages and cultures, and a preference for integration rather than conquest or exclusion. This too will need to be part of any paradigm for our survival. Amergin, a poet, lawmaker and migrant whose existence may have been only in the realm of myth, nonetheless has much to teach us.
That was the poet Paddy Bushe reading his migrant poet's Ecological Manifesto. If we take on board Paddy's argument that we need to find ways to identify ourselves with the other life forms of the earth, the sea and the sky, then an obvious next step would be to figure out what sort of practical, concrete measures can be taken to help achieve that.
We spoke to Órla O'Donovan, a lecturer and researcher at University College Cork, who has done extensive research on the commons. To begin with, we asked Órla what her own reaction was to Paddy's manifesto.
Well, the first thing that struck me when reading Paddy's manifesto was just the temporality of it, the relationship with time. So I really liked the way he located where his house sits on the cliff and the shaping of the cliff over time. So the time frame of his piece is vast. And I think that's something that kind of time frame is something we really need to cultivate. And it's not so much about seeing, a range. It's not so much about being able to go way back in time, but it's also about maybe disrupting this idea that, the past is very distinct from the present, but how things of the past have implications, live with us in the present. And likewise, where he talks about, the concerns with climate change and the concern about the likelihood of his house falling into the sea within the lifetime of his grandchildren. So it's where the future is present too. So not only is the temporality of it, the range of it vast, but it's also where this distinction between past, present and future isn't the conventional way in which we think of those. Also, what I like about that broad temporality of his piece is how it encourages a more human modesty. One of the things that has contributed to us being in the mess that we are in, environmentally and otherwise, is the very short time frame, the very short memory that we have. That's one piece that that really, really appealed to me. Then his response and his reinterpretation of the poem from Leabhar Gabhála is completely, I think it's completely in keeping with the way people who are interested in the commons movement are encouraging us to rethink at a very fundamental level what it is to be human, and also to rethink how we relate not only to each other but how we relate to things as well. So when I was reading when I was reading some of the pieces, he has a whole section on where he abandons the ismisha or ismay and replaces with the She connects beautifully with the that it is about trying to move away from the pervasive individualism of our time, where we have this mythical notion of ourselves as these singular entities, and replaces that with, an emphasis on interrelatedness and our interdependencies. I was at a fabulous talk recently given by the philosopher Judith Butler, where she was talking about this fundamental problem of this myth of the individual. And she was talking about, she gave the example of the figure of Robinson Crusoe, that this is the model of the Western individual. So it's a man without needs, a man who's radically self-sufficient. But if we look at the story of Robinson Crusoe, we can see that Robinson Crusoe was, completely dependent on the invisible assistance of Man Friday and others too, other beings and other things. So she was holding up this mythical figure of Robinson Crusoe as the Ismay, the original reading of Amergin coming in, staking his claim, and so she too was calling for this abandonment of the Robinson Crusoe figure and the replacement of the figure that Paddy is calling on us to see ourselves as interrelated and interdependent. So I loved it.
Great. Maybe just linking into that, and maybe you could just talk a little bit, like the current commons approach, if you take it that way. It's spoken about in the context of climate change. Certainly, everybody is starting to realise that we need to act urgently now. I mean, there's really a sense, if not a crisis, then of urgency coming about, and it's only the political leadership which is kind of not doing anything. But how, thinking of what you just said about Paddy Bushe and temporality and all the rest of it, how significant approach to the commons can it be in tackling climate change?
I think it offers considerable potential, because I think we are living a time when, as you say, increasingly the dysfunctional market and state relations are becoming more and more apparent. And I think what the commons movement does is it shows us that the state and the market don't just exhaust our range of possibilities, that there are other possibilities too. Now, I think it is important to acknowledge that the commons movement is very much a work in progress, and there's all sorts of internal divisions within the commons movement. There's all kinds of versions of it. But I think what unifies these movements, or unifies this movement, is a recognition of the possibility of the commons. And also, I suppose conventionally there's this idea, well, for many years, there has been this idea that commons initiatives inevitably fail because human beings are fundamentally competitive or individualistic or greedy, or, so that there has been this idea that because of the human condition, understood in a very particular way, that commoning is impossible. Paddy Bushe doesn't accept that is the kind of even range of possibilities of what it is to be human, that we see that to be human can be something other than being individualistic, competitive, greedy, etc. Then this argument about the inevitable, tragedy of the commons, that can go. But I think within the commons movement, what has been significant has been the work of people who've shown that it's not just, the commons isn't just a utopian project, but that there are many examples of actual commoning in practice. There are many existing things happening in the world around us where we can see real life commoning. Some people call these Nowtopias, where it's not just something in the future, but that we can see these in the present. So these do offer some sort of alternative possibility. So I think one of the major contributions of the commons as a broad approach, one of the big contributions is that it helps to move us away from seeing what we might call nature, move us away from even the thinking of nature in terms of natural resources. So it helps us get away from this idea that aspects of nature, such as water, are there, that they're resources to be owned either publicly or privately, but that need to be managed, and that are the raw material for economic production. What the commons approach gets us to do is not only to rethink what it is to be human, but it also gets us to rethink to go beyond this idea of resources. So going back to Paddy's poem, where he talks about, Maid Lor Mara, or in his English translation, Am Ocean's Voice, or later in his discussion where he talks about Amergin's poem that he's speaking collectively, where he says he is the wind, he is the sea. It is where we see our connections with, if we take water, that it's rather than seeing water as this thing outside of ourselves, what a commons approach, or some versions of commoning encourage us to see, is that we can't be separated from water, that there's always water in us and through us, going through us. So it's this idea of a separateness doesn't really stand up to our experiences of the world. We had a wonderful thinkery on water here a few years ago, and we had a woman called Chas Jewett, who's involved she's one of the Standing Rock water protesters, or protectors, and she talked about how one of their slogans is "We are water." So it's about asserting that connection, rather than water is something that we feel that we have a right to, but it's actually part of us. So it is that radical rethinking of our relationship with the land or sea or water, that move away from the resources thinking, this idea that these are things to be exploited and used by us. I think that offers some sort of radical step away from the very dysfunctional market and state relations we've had with water and other things in the past.
We've all lived in Ireland. We've lived through the whole water charges debacle, let's put it that way, and how so many people in Ireland have this kind of a sense that water is a human right for us to have, and we shouldn't pay for it at all. In your discussions at that thinkery, what would your reaction be to that? I mean, is that part of a kind of a fundamental Irish approach to the commons, or is it something which you would consider to be negative?
Well, no, the whole controversy about water was central to that thinkery on water that we held here a few years ago. I was one of the people who was opposed to the introduction of water charges. And in fact, I served on the Public Water Forum as somebody who was opposed to water charges. And my opposition was based on, I felt that it was an austerity measure, so I opposed it on that basis. But also, one of the reasons I didn't support the introduction of charges, because I know many people within the environmental movement felt that, the plastic bag charges, etc., this was a good way, that it's an effective way of getting people to, I suppose, be mindful of, their use of plastics or their use of water. But what I disliked about charges was that it really appealed to an economic mentality. So it's where you appeal to people just as economic actors, which isn't what the commons movement does. And what I think what the commons movement and what we were exploring at how within. So if you take the water controversy in Ireland, that part of one of the issues we explored was how many people, now not everybody in Ireland, certainly people who are not part of group water schemes, but for many people, particularly people living in urban areas, that we have very little understanding or appreciation of where water comes or goes to. So you put on your tap, it comes out. You don't know where it comes. That we have this disconnection from different type of water disconnection to what was being threatened to people who wouldn't pay. But it's where It's where, you turn on your water without any great knowledge of where it comes to. And likewise, you flush your toilet or you leave water go down your sink and you've no idea where it goes. I really like the idea or the argument that's made by he's a commons theorist, by Gustavo Esteva, the Mexican commons theorist, where he talks about the flush toilet as being the perfect metaphor for a consumer society, where you do your shit and you wash your hands of it. You forget about it. Somebody else's problem. So part of what we were talking about at the Thinkery, and part of what a commons response to the water struggles in Ireland would be that first of all we need to become more knowledgeable about it. We need to remember where water comes from. We need to remember where it goes to. We need some sort of basic water literacy. That was one point. The other was that, and it's going back to the point in Paddy Bushe's piece, where he's talking about the interrelatedness and the interdependency, where he's removing the ismisha and ismay, so he's seeing this as a more collective relationship with the dew or with the cliff or with the sea or the wind. And the other strategy that we saw is that it's like a remembering, but where you hyphen, so it's re-membering, where it's trying to recover this kind of disconnection, how we've become separated, disconnected, dismembered from the world around us. Commons Project is about re-establishing, like remembering ourselves, reconnecting with water as just part of the world around us.
What would we need to do to make a change to a more commons-based society and economy, and how long will it take for us to make these changes?
Well, I think it's good to look for sources of inspiration from people who are already engaged in commoning, who are actually part of these Nowtopias, even no matter how modest they are. So these might be people who are involved in community gardens, for example, or where people are engaged in some kind of experiments in actual commoning, and that it's not about seeing. Now we can see some of these are quite famous and quite far away from us here in Ireland. So Gustavo Esteva, for example, talks about how the Zapatistas for many years have, like in their how they have been involved in their leaving commons. But I think we can see seeds of these new societies in our own lives. We can see examples, even very small examples, of where people are involved in commoning around, say, childcare. We do this often, between friends and relatives. So it's not just all, kind of major initiatives that are recognised, for their political significance. But we can see actual examples in relation to water, I think, and at our Thinkery on Water and some work we've been doing subsequently, we can see how within group water schemes here in Ireland, that's where out of necessity people have had to remember water, have had to know where it comes from and where it goes to, but also where people have been involved through community organising, been involved in relating to water in a very different way to those of us who just turn on our tap in urban settings.
That was Órla O'Donovan, a lecturer in Applied Social Studies at University College Cork, discussing the extensive research that she has done into the commons.
In our next podcast, we'll be looking at what might happen if we apply a more commons-oriented mentality to money and the financial system.
We'll be looking at alternatives to the current money system that might be a big help in moving towards a more balanced economy and society.
So we hope you'll tune into the next episode of Beyond the Obvious, this time next month. Many thanks to Paddy Bushe and to Órla O'Donovan for their contributions, and as usual to Leisha Kelly for her music on the harp.